Sander, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, I'm Sander van der Linden. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And I study very broadly how people are influenced by information, particularly information that's false, misinformation, including manipulation and other forms of influence, and how we can help people resist it through what I call psychological inoculation.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I do on a daily basis. Yeah.
And it seems like for you to have been in this field for 10 years, you had some insight as to what was going to happen in the world. But what in the world got you interested in this field? It seems kind of an obscure field 10 years ago, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean it was relatively obscure. I started out my interest was originally in why people acquire odd beliefs about the world, including things like superstition and magical thinking and how people are fooled by rhetorical tricks and illusions and conspiracy theories, which was one of my main interests. And at the time, nobody really cared about conspiracy theories. People thought it was kind of a kooky thing to study, like, oh, okay, who are these five individuals in Area 51, looking for aliens? And I wasn't, it wasn't intentionally that I decided, oh, I'm going to write my doctoral dissertation on something like conspiracy theories. But it was always a topic that I found of interest, and I've I, I've revealed this in some interviews. When I was very young, I had this interest in duping my friends and seeing what the responses would be, and so it would just be innocent stuff. Like I would say, "Oh, did you know the exam is canceled today?" And they'd be like, "Really?" And then like cheering, and as they would be walking away, we're like, "No, no." I debriefed them as a good psychologist, right? I wouldn't actually let them walk out. It's like, no, no. And then it's like, what made them think that was legitimate information, right? Is it trust? And I was always sort of fascinated. And then when the internet came about, I started getting really interested in online deception and this whole idea that people in chat rooms could be anyone,
Mhm.
pretending to be anyone. I started getting into the early days of I guess people call hacking. I mean, by no means did I ever become a professional or did anything illegal for that matter. But I became fascinated by this process of how people might be manipulated. And then on a personal level, it's a bit more grim. But my family is Jewish. We're from Europe, and most of the family on my mother's side was executed during World War II by the Nazis. And so, we always have these discussions about how certain kinds of information can actually impact people to do really bad things, and how do people, or masses of people become convinced of conspiracy theories that can actually lead to harm and violence. And so that was always something that was kind of in the back of my mind as something that seems impactful and an interesting psychological puzzle. It wasn't that I kind of made that my topic of study, but over the years, all of these interests kind of came together for me when I started studying psychology. And then within psychology, I decided that influence and how people become convinced of particularly false information was going to be
Mhm.
my ultimate topic. Yeah.
That's interesting. So let's put a category. Can you define what misinformation is?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the key thing when I talk about whenever I give a talk, people always have their opinions about what's misinformation, what's not. So, for me, misinformation is just any information that is either false or misleading. I think it's important to have both in there because, people say, okay, but how do you determine whether something is false or not? So there's all kinds of methods, right? There's independent fact checkers. There's scientific consensus in the field. I mean, most physicists agree that the Earth is round, not flat. Even none of us have perfect knowledge, but we rely on scientific consensus as a benchmark for what is likely to be true about the world. Or fact. So there's expert consensus or fact checkers or other modes of acquiring knowledge. And then misleading often tends to be information that's not entirely false, but it is manipulative in some way. Either it's deliberately lacking context, it's using a particular kind of framing, or a particular technique to influence people without their knowledge. So misinformation for me is stuff that's either false or misleading. But then disinformation is what I'm much more concerned about, which is misinformation coupled with some psychological intention to actually deceive or harm other people with explicit intent. And so you're actually, knowingly spreading false information with some agenda, which could be political, which kind of makes it propaganda, or it could be non-political. But yeah, I'm much more concerned. Technically, if a journalist makes an error, that's misinformation,
Mhm.
right? But we all know people make errors, and sometimes that happens. So I'm much more concerned about disinformation.
And so, for misleading, in your mind, there's an intent behind it. It's not that there's a factual mistake necessarily, but there's an implied intent behind it.
Yeah, so that's where it gets really tricky, I think, from a legal sort of perspective. And so, we often ask ourselves this question, can you be misleading without it being intentional? I think the answer is yes. I think sometimes people can unconsciously create headlines that are misleading, but they didn't mean for it to be misleading. That happens sometimes, but I think the majority of the time it is intentional, even though it might be difficult to prove. So I tend to use the word misinformation when there's no documented evidence to prove intent, which would
Mhm.
make it disinformation. But sometimes we can. I mean, right off the bat, to get into some hot examples, the tobacco industry, the one of the courts in the U.S. made a pretty significant ruling not too long ago that the tobacco industry misled people on the link between health and smoking, and that they did so deliberately, which they sourced out of documents which show that they knew that it was harmful and intentionally decided to withhold that from people and cast doubt on the science. So that's an example where we can say that's clearly disinformation. Whereas a lot of the time you just don't know whether they really intentionally did this, or whether it was kind of an accident, or unconsciously somebody wrote a headline and they didn't really mean it. And so I tend to want to give people the benefit of the doubt, so I tend to say misinformation unless we have evidence that it's disinfo.
Is some of it that since so much of our information that we get nowadays is online, that there's this, I hate to phrase it this way, that there's a need to be more sensational when you talk about something, otherwise people won't listen to you. So people write clickbaity headlines that are probably somewhat misleading in order to get people to click and read the article.
Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment. That's definitely true for social media companies, but also, I think for the internet more generally. I mean, even credible news outlets are forced more and more to come up with sensationalist headlines to get people to click. And it's unfortunate because, a lot of the advice that we give is about neutrality and objectivity and not using manipulative wording and language. But I think even though credible outlets will often totally agree with that, I think in the back of their minds they're thinking, that's nice, Sander, but we're not going to make any money that way. And so we need to survive too, right? People need
Yeah.
to click on the stuff. It's an attention economy now, and so we're all fighting for people's attention. We have to use some of these tactics, and so it is interesting because people often tell me about some of the techniques that I talk about in the book Foolproof, that's kind of summarizes my research on this topic. Some people say, "Look, I'm an influencer. I use some of these techniques. Are you saying I'm spreading misinformation?" And it's sort of like, well, what I'm saying is, if you define misinformation as using manipulative tactics, then yes. I mean, because you're trying to influence people in ways that are not necessarily accurate and objective, and I mean that can be there can be various degrees of of people being okay with that, as long as we're transparent and it's ethical, and so on. And sometimes it's actually done to harm people or confuse people, or for less positive purposes. But at the end of the day, for me, it's sort of like, well, it can't possibly be a bad thing for people to be aware of these techniques.
Yeah. So, what is some of the language that you would define as manipulative? Are there some key phrases, emotional responses that indicate manipulative language, even if we don't see it in the words that are being used?
Yeah, so when you do, when we look at data online, big data, so we gather, millions of observations from scraping, we scrape that online, and then we analyze it with dictionaries and linguistic classifiers to understand the sentiment of different types of content, and then we see what predicts virality online, and also what the accuracy level is of the information or the veracity. And typically, what you see is, kind of what you said in the beginning. It has information that tends to go viral and also tends to be less accurate is the stuff that's shocking, that's novel, that's grabbing people's attention. And so outrage is one of those factors that does really well. So creating what we call moral outrage. And in fact, there's a dictionary called, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's like you won't believe da 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 da.
Yeah, yeah. And there's even a dictionary for moral emotional words. And those are particular kinds of words. So we know that emotional content is more likely to go viral. So things like fear mongering. Fear is a very popular emotion. So any type of headline that tries to convey a sense of fear, instill a sense of fear in people, or stuff that makes people angry, and that kind of leads to outrage. But there are very specific words. Particularly things like pedophile. That's a moral, emotional word. That's why a lot of the conspiracies tend to
Mm.
invoke satanic pedophile rings, because that combo is not only emotional, it's also moral. And so when you hit that nexus of something that's both negative and moral, then you get bonus points for when you're predicting virality.
Yeah, nobody's gonna be for satanic pedophiles.
Exactly, exactly. Everyone thinks that's bad, all right? And so that's what gets you traction. But then also other things like one of the biggest predictors we found above and beyond moral and emotional language is what we call in-group versus out-group language. And so if you write something negative about the other side, that really gets traction on social media. And so, if let's say you're a liberal, you say something nasty about conservatives, and vice versa. If you're a conservative, you say something nasty about liberals. That really sees a lot of uptake on social media. And that's what we later sort of term the perverse incentives of social media, because people learn what gets rewarded.
Yeah.
And so if being negative about the other side gets traction, then that's what's being incentivized, and that's not a good thing for discourse, because even though not all of it is false, the toxicity level, polarization levels get high. The veracity of the content lower and lower quality, and so it's kind of eroding public discourse at a more at a more subtle level in some ways. And yeah, that's why I personally think, and that's why I focus a lot on these manipulative contexts, because the stuff that's obviously false, if you quantify that in the media, ecosystem, that's not the most prevalent stuff. I mean, yes, your
Yeah.
flat Earth, and there are obvious falsehoods like that, but that's not the bulk of the problem. The bulk is the stuff that might be a little true here and there, but actually it's quite manipulative and misleading, and that's what gets people worked up a lot. And that's why you see a lot of the flame wars, and that's actually the most toxic stuff.
Is there a forecast model of a doom spiral, so to speak, that as language gets more harsh and rhetoric gets more inflammatory, is there a point kind of in modeling it where it just breaks down, or does it just keep getting worse and worse and worse until people say, this is ridiculous, I'm just not even going to pay attention to these people anymore?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the models that I've seen is some of them do kind of predict tipping points, and these are, as I'm sure you're familiar with that term, early detection sort of systems that are being built to try to understand discourse online and see what's taking off. But it's hard to say at which point people disengage. When we talk to social media companies, and we do some work with them, they often tell us that sometimes they do ping people, kind of like when, maybe this is only me, and I'll be honest here, but Netflix sometimes asks me if I still want to continue watching,
Yeah.
because you've watched a lot of content. And so it's the same online. When you're in an echo chamber or flame war, sometimes they'll ping people and say, are you still interested in this? And most people then actually say, no, I'm not interested in this, but somehow they get stuck in it. And that's kind of the problem. I think that a lot of people don't want this stuff, but somehow they find themselves part of some flame war or echo chamber.
Do you think that's part of the problem of why we're seeing, or at least in the perception, we're seeing more disinformation, more misinformation, more manipulative language is because I hate to blame it on it's the algorithm, but the algorithms are rewarding people for that behavior. They're doing more of it, so therefore we're watching more of it. It comes back to that doom spiral, and it's when you're inside it, it's hard to see that you're a part of it.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a really complicated question. I mean, there were just a few papers published recently from Meta, and you know, I think the gist of what they were saying was that there's more going on than the algorithm, because they tried to experiment with the algorithm and they didn't necessarily find that it reduced polarization, but that also doesn't mean that the algorithm isn't the cause of it, right? It's a complex sort of system, but the typical argument they bring is, well, people were polarized before social media, so
Yeah,
how could social media possibly be the cause of all of this, right? And so I think maybe it's kind of like what you were saying, that I think the algorithms can be the amplifier of something that's already existing, right? There's existing tensions in society, and the algorithms certainly can be a powerful amplifier of those tensions by rewarding the content that's more extreme, more polarizing, more toxic, rather than incentivizing constructive debate, because that doesn't get clicks and engagement, and that's kind of tied to the business model of how these companies are run, and it's not an easy solution in terms of what else they would be optimizing for if it's not engagement, or if it's not what gets, because they often look at the user behavior, right? And if
yeah,
people are clicking, people are liking, so that's input, right? That it's telling us that this is what they want, but then if they survey people say, oh, we don't want that. And so it's complicated, because if you're trapped in a system like that, then sure, you're going to click, you're going to but if you ask people, if you step outside the matrix for a moment, people say, oh no, that's not what I want. And so how do you design systems that don't, that still make people money, but don't promote this kind of content? That's really the $1 million question, I think, that everyone's currently thinking about. And it's really difficult. Happy to talk about some of the solutions we've explored. But yeah, I think broadly the algorithms are a major amplifier. And to give you an example from, a non-Western context, WhatsApp uses end-to-end encryption, right? And
hmm
so they actually can't do anything, or I mean, they could, but they, given that they want to preserve people's privacy, they don't actively intervene. So they had this problem years ago where rumors were spread on WhatsApp about local kidnappers in India,
hmm
and people in local rural areas just take that stuff at face value. They get a message that goes viral saying there's kidnappers. Here's what they look like. They go outside, they see somebody that looks like that, and they lynch that person. And it turns out that information was fake, and so that was extremely concerning, because these things were going viral, people were getting killed. WhatsApp was under tremendous pressure by the Indian government to release the phone numbers of these people, and obviously they're like, "Whoa, we don't want to be releasing phone numbers to the government because they can go and hunt people down." That
yeah.
doesn't seem like a good scenario. But also, we don't want to be facilitating this stuff. But clearly, the lynchings weren't the result of the algorithm. I mean, there are ethnic tensions in India that were clearly being used to further some of this stuff, right? So there are existing tensions people can tap into, and WhatsApp seemed like the ideal vehicle, and so they
hmm
were obviously used as a way to do that. And they didn't have the limitations on how many messages you can forward back then, or how many groups, and so that is how things can spread very quickly from one person to another, and can get people killed. And so that's um, I think what differentiates modern times from perhaps when you were in the Roman era and everything was going by horse and carriage, and it took a bit longer for people to find you and spread a rumor. Yeah.
I was gonna say, so is kind of that part of the mix of turbocharging this is that it's just the misinformation can spread faster now than it could 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's part of it. So it can definitely spread faster. In the book, I do some calculations, actually calculate based on the estimates of historians of how long it would take in the Roman postal system for a message to travel, and how fast, let's say somebody like Obama can get a message to all of his followers. And so that is obviously a huge differential. But I think there's more to the story as well. So part of the story is also that the structure of the information environment has changed pretty drastically. So people are getting inputs. It's not just cable TV anymore, right? Or just regular TV and radio. It's the podcast, it's Spotify, it's YouTube, it's Instagram, it's Snapchat, it's TikTok. Um, People are being bombarded with information, whether it's direct browsing, social media, or audio from all sorts of venues. And it's really difficult actually now to try to capture how much misinformation or how much inaccurate information somebody receives on a daily basis. So there are studies that somewhat confidently claim to have estimates, but I'm always quite skeptical because they typically look at one platform, let's say during an election. Um, but it's dozens of platforms.
Yeah.
It's not only your neighbors and your cranky uncle, but also the internet and the TV, and it's everything. And so how do you calculate that? It's not an easy challenge to try to get a picture. And so I do think, we also have a landscape that's vastly different, and it's fragmented much more. So now we talk about mainstream social media, like
Yeah.
Twitter or X,
Yep.
we should say now, right? X and Facebook. Whereas you have, your Rumble and Parler and Telegram, and so, it's becoming much more fragmented, which also means that when you're trying to get to people, you can't just go to one or two platforms and reach everyone. It's now everyone's scattered in their own echo chamber now. And so that makes it much more difficult. And some people say, oh, sure, okay, but there's not that many people on these alt tech platforms, which for now might be true in relative terms. But people are jumping from one to the other. And so it is becoming I think more fragmented, and you could say that's somewhat of a good thing. We don't want the market controlled by one or two platforms. That's probably not a good thing
Yeah.
either, right? So there should be a happy middle, but there's a lot of fragmentation at the moment. And then the third really is you know the way that technology is shaping information itself. I mean, WhatsApp is different, right? Because it you get messages from people in your group. So there's a whole group psychology at work there. These are people you know and trust
Yeah.
usually. And so it has this inherent value, right? You think it's credible. And so that's very different from, anonymous tweets that you read on Twitter. And YouTube is again different. It's the sort of audio visual thing where you're being, sucked into a charismatic um, um, podcaster,
Yeah.
right? And so you're, and so that's a whole different sort of vehicle. So I think the unique features of how people interact with technology are also quite different.
So, what in the world do we do to, using your phrase earlier, inoculate ourselves against misinformation, disinformation? I know what everybody would like to say is, well, either love the answer of or hate the answer of is, well, the platforms just need to do more. Uh, put it on somebody else to solve the problem, and that way I don't have to solve it. So I guess there's two ways to look at, like, what should the platforms be doing, whether it's mainstream media, broadcast, cable, news websites, social media platforms, versus what should I personally be doing in my life and my interactions.
Yeah. So, as a psychologist, I'm kind of biased towards things that I know about, which are solutions at the individual sort of level. But you're quite right. So when we have these conversations at a larger level, you have two camps of people. One who say, well, wow, this individual stuff is a distraction because the social media companies and the government, that we need to have more strict regulation, and social media companies need to fix it. And then other people say, no, no, we don't want them interfering with free speech. They shouldn't be shouldn't be doing anything. And so that's where I kind of, at the level of our solution is kind of like, well, we have a solution that maybe doesn't rub people the wrong way. It's just to empower individuals to discern what is manipulation and what is less likely to be manipulation. And so maybe I'll first explain that, and then I'll come back to the trade-off
Yeah.
between these bigger issues. So the inoculation analogy kind of follows the vaccine metaphor quite exactly in the sense that just as you expose your body to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, it turns out that you could do the same with the human mind. So in a lot of research, we found that when you expose the mind to weakened doses of misinformation or the tactics that are used to spread misinformation, and you refute them persuasively in advance and deconstruct the manipulation techniques for people, we can build up mental or cognitive resistance, even antibodies, if you think of it, mental antibodies against future attempts to dupe us with misinformation. And we do this. We started out doing this in the lab, where we have people come in and we expose them to a weakened dose of potent misinformation, and then we refute it in advance or help them see the manipulative tactics, and then we expose people to the full quote unquote virus later on, and we find that they become more resistant. And so, just as your body needs lots of copies of potential invaders to know which proteins are the healthy ones and which ones look like invaders, it kind of works the same with the mind. The mind needs lots of doses, micro doses of what deception looks like in order to start recognizing the patterns. And it's sort of, I think, analogous. Well, let me say this. So I'm not against facts, right? So fact checking and education and that's all good,
Hmm.
but that's not going to help you when it comes. Maybe if we put this in sort of cyber attack terms, you know, maybe for some of the audience, that it's good to have broad knowledge, but when you're faced with a specific attack on your system, you're going to have a response that's tailored to the type of attack that you're facing.
Yeah.
And so, even though facts and critical thinking are useful in general, what we often find is people have no mental defenses for the specific misinformation that they come across. And so, you need to what we call pre-bunk that in advance so that people can withstand the attack when it actually happens and when they're being targeted. And I just did this. It sounds ridiculous, but I was just in a disinformation summit. Okay, these were 200 disinformation researchers, and somebody asked why people believe in flat Earth, and I said, there's all sorts of social explanations for that. For a lot of people, it's not so much whether it's really flat or not, but it's conspiratorial, and there are people who believe in one conspiracy tend to believe in others, and but the other side of the story is that at a cognitive level, people actually don't have a lot of mental defenses. So it's not like I can convince you that the Earth is flat in the conversation, but I can get people to be a little bit more uncertain about their beliefs because when I asked a room of 200 people if they were being honest with themselves, and I will ask them who would raise their hand and explain why the Earth is round and not flat. What are the physical science mechanisms that explain that? And like two people in a room of 200 raised their
Yeah.
hand who were confident enough to actually. So most people, they don't have the mental defenses ready to actually counter argue and resist somebody who is going to throw facts at you about why the earth is flat and all the sciencey sounding stuff. And it sounds ridiculous with flat earth, but they do it with whether it's vaccines or climate or GMOs or whatever the topic is. People can spout a lot of scientific stuff. My own family forwarded me a WhatsApp message of some doctor who was, you know, using a blow dryer up his nose to kill the coronavirus. I mean, something ridiculous. But he had scientific papers, and if you don't have, if you don't know, then you don't have credible ways of right
Yeah.
of responding to it. And so that's really the idea behind inoculation, that you need to get people ready. And there's various ways of doing that. You can do that with specific falsehoods, but you can also do it at a more general kind of what we call technique-based level. And I think here's where it gets uh, where the approach I think is particularly useful when you think of it as a broader spectrum vaccine. So you could do it with flat Earth, and I can tell you in advance what the arguments are going to be and how to refute that and so on. But it doesn't scale very well because
Yeah.
next time they're going to come with some other conspiracy, and then you don't have the mental defense. So it's much more useful to actually inoculate people against the building blocks of, let's say, a conspiracy theory, or what polarizing headlines, how
Hmm.
they are crafted, or how emotions like fear mongering or outrage are used, or trolling, how to baiting people online, and how what that looks like, and how they want you to respond, and how you get sucked into these things, which is very active during elections, trolling and false amplification through bots, for example, bot armies, um, and impersonation, fake doctors impersonating politicians, celebrities. And so what we found is that you can inoculate people against these larger techniques, and we've developed some games to get people interested, because the other thing we found is that people don't want to be bored with some
Yeah.
media literacy lecture, and so we have some edgy games. One is called Bad News, and it allows you to step into the shoes of a manipulator. And it's a social media simulation, and your goal is actually to gain followers by duping people using weakened doses of some of these tactics. Um, if you're being too ridiculous, you lose all credibility because that's not what a clever manipulator would do, right? And
Yeah.
so people go through the simulation and they build up the resistance to these tactics by actually, being in a simulator and kind of like a flight simulator, right? But being, you get the experience,
Yeah.
and that motivates people's immunity, so to speak. And yeah, so that's kind of how we do it.
Yeah, because the question that popped into my head is when you talked about low doses or low exposure to small amounts of misinformation. The thing that popped into my head, the conspiracy theory response was, well, but who chooses what information that you're seeding as misinformation?
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah. And the key thing, sometimes people misunderstand is the key thing is not just to expose people to the weakened dose of the misinformation, but also give people the tools to dismantle it, right? Because
Yeah.
without that part, you run the risk of just kind of spreading the misinformation. And so, we use humor and sarcasm to sort of weaken it. The thing is, when you're synthesizing a weakened dose out of a specific falsehood, you are in a situation where there is some ground truth that you're going to have to establish, right? So, for example, coming back to the definition, right, you have to turn to fact checkers or scientific consensus to say, well, this is actually the truth, this is misinformation. Now I'm going to, extract a weakened dose. So I can give you a specific example. So, let's talk about climate change, for example. You know, over 97% of scientists, whether it's 99 or 97, think that, humans are at least partly contributing to global warming. Um, there are websites out there, using uh, fake petitions claiming that thousands of scientists say that global warming isn't real. But then when you look at the petition, there's like the Spice Girls, Charles Darwin. It's unverified stuff, right? Anyone
Yeah.
can sign this thing. And so that could be the weakened dose. And that's what we used in some of our experiments to say, look, here's what an unverified petition looks like. You get people like Dr. Gary Halliwell from the Spice Girls and deceased people like Charles Darwin. And so, you sort of deconstruct the fake petition technique. And then, you reinforce the idea that there is a scientific consensus on climate change. And that's, you have to accept that there are some things that are true. I mean, same with flat Earth, right? You would show what are some of the techniques that flat earthers use, and then you inoculate people with sort of, well, here's actually what you need to know about why the Earth is flat. These are some of the nobody round, right? For
Yeah.
people paying attention, just this like, well, why the Earth is round, right here, and then some of the techniques that are used to convince people that the Earth is flat. However, some people, including social media companies, initially weren't comfortable with that, and so they were like, "Oh, we don't want to talk about climate change, immigration. We're not arbiters of truth. So
Yeah.
we need something a little lighter touch than this approach." I mean, for scientists, it's a bit, we're kind of like, well, I mean, there's a scientific consensus, or there's fact checkers, and we gotta establish truth somewhere. But okay, let's think about this. So if you're a social media company or a government, so we started thinking about this, and we're like, well, actually, it's probably a good thing if social media companies or the government aren't going to tell people what they need to believe, because even though we might like one government, maybe the next government, people are not going to like. And so the idea is, well, how could a government or a social media company or any entity really, um, scale this inoculation approach in a way that's going to be in the public interest. And so one of the things that we came up with was this what we call technique level inoculation. And so the technique level inoculation doesn't assume necessarily that there's a ground truth for something, but it does make people aware of key manipulative tactics, and then allows people to make their own sort of informed choice about what they want to believe, but it exposes the technique in a way, in a very nonpartisan sort of way. And so, to give you an example, I mean, there are real examples, and so I can give some political examples that might resonate in the U.S., and also some non-political examples. But talking about podcasts and YouTube, false dichotomies are huge. So politicians love using false dichotomies. So the
Yeah.
technique here is to, right, is to present two options, even though there's more. So you take away all nuance, and it gets people into more extremist modes of thinking, right? So either uh, so when we did a bit of this work with Google, who owns YouTube, and on YouTube, for example, you get these extremist recruitment videos like, oh, either you join ISIS or you're not a good Muslim,
Yeah.
right? And that's sort of like putting people into the mindset of either you become more extremist or you're not a good person. That one's extreme, but then there are these political gurus on YouTube that radicalize often young men, but also
Yeah.
other people using these rhetorical techniques, and they're not it's okay to influence people, if they know about it. That's my personal opinion, if you're being ethical about it. But if you use rhetorical, logical fallacies without people's knowledge to get them to be more extreme, I think that's what I would consider manipulation, and people should know about that, right?
Yeah.
And so um, organizations use it too. I mean, some people are not going to like this example, but objectively, regardless of how you feel about guns, um, I think the NRA tweeted something like, during the mass shootings, either you're pro AR-15 rifles or you're against the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
I mean that's just not true. And so people can like guns right, and also the Second Amendment. People can not like certain guns and also like the Second Amendment. And so I think that the nuance, it's a tactic to get rid of all the nuance.
Yeah.
And so what do we do in the inoculation approach? So we don't talk about any of this stuff. So we show people a clip. This is for YouTube. So these videos, those annoying ads that you can't skip
Yeah.
on YouTube. That's where the pre-bunk would go. And so we have the weekend dose would be Star Wars. Okay, and so all of a sudden the clip cuts in from Revenge of the Sith. I'm not sure if you're a Star Wars fan, Chris, but this is Anakin Skywalker talking to Obi-Wan. For people who don't know, Anakin goes on to become Darth Vader,
Ah,
and
that's
he
a
sort of says,
spoiler.
spoiler, yeah, spoiler alert, um, massive spoiler alert. He says, right, either you're with me or you're my enemy. And
Yeah.
then Obi-Wan replies and says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And for the really clever listener, that's an absolute statement also.
Yeah.
But the idea here is that the narrator goes, look, nobody wants to be a Sith, right? Don't use manipulation techniques. And the thing is that either you're with me or you're my enemy. That's the structure of all false dichotomies that are used by real organizations and people and politicians and everywhere. And so you don't need to talk about any controversial stuff. You just give people the template of the manipulation technique. And then we test people, in the 24 hours later, we would target them at some misinformation ad, or that would use some of these tactics. And then we find that it helps boost people's recognition of these techniques. Others are called scapegoating. You blame a whole group in society
Yeah.
for something that isn't their fault. Again, the weekend dose is South Park, right? It's the Canadians.
Yeah.
And so I think whether you're liberal or conservative, Star Wars, South Park, everyone can relate to that. We can all agree on both sides of the aisle that these techniques are bad. And if it's your party who uses them, we should call it out, right? If it's the other party, we should call it out. And so that's sort of the thing that I think at the minimalist level, inoculation can work in that way, and it is pretty minimal because some people complain and say, okay, but you're helping people spot these techniques, but you're not changing their minds. And so the idea is, or maybe, right, maybe you're
Yeah.
not changing their mind. The idea is, well, that's not our goal. Our goal is to help people recognize manipulation online so that people are empowered to then form their own opinions. And especially if you think about education, integrating this into schools, or when social media companies or governments use this, some people are like, okay, why do you work with Meta or Google or the US government and so on? And it's sort of, people who don't like big corporations complain,
Yeah.
people who don't like the government complain to me. And it's sort of like, well, the thing is, if they end up making use of these techniques themselves against their own people or their own users, then they've only invested in making people more immune by scaling knowledge of these techniques. And so that's why it doesn't bother me. But I agree that we don't do work where I got this call once from the shampoo company that claimed that people were spreading misinformation about the shampoo, and they wanted to inoculate their customers, and sort of like, I don't want to get involved here
Yeah.
in terms of what's the truth about this chemical shampoo. Like, is it really destroying people's hair, or is it? And so, that's kind of the thing where I'm like, the ground truth here is even unsure. There's no scientific consensus here, right? Or some fact checked information. So this is getting too murky. But I can see, you know, where how people might think about this approach. But I think ideally it'd be used to preempt and prebunk these larger rhetorical fallacies that keep popping up time and again.
I mean, it's interesting because I start seeing this has wider implications beyond what we would generally think of as I'm going to classify it as like media disinformation or news-ish, news adjacent media. But I think it would also help keep us from getting, even individually targeted scams because like you now have these skill sets to look at like, well, this isn't a reasonable interaction. Why is this unreasonable interaction happening, and being able to step back and look at it with a little bit more skepticism, a little bit more kind of being disconnected from it a little bit.
Yeah, and I've been getting into the scamming literature because a lot of scam experts have told me, look, this seems like the ideal test case for this approach, and I totally agree. I mean, there are some contexts where inoculation is a bit trickier, but I think for us, if in any domain where techniques are being used against people and you can break those down and inoculate people against them, that's a good sort of context. I mean, we've done stuff in Iran and in formerly ISIS occupied areas where we break down the extremist recruitment techniques for youngsters and inoculate against them so that when it actually happens they can recognize it. And I think it's similar with scams. And so there's different you're more expert on this than me obviously, but there's different types of scams that one can consider. And I have some computer science colleagues who would tell me, so part of the inoculation is forewarning people that they might be manipulated to sort of jumpstart the
Yeah.
psychological immune system, because that's sleeping most of the time, because we just assume that most stuff is not deception, which, and sometimes that's a reasonable assumption, but other times it's not. But they tell me, like, look, this forewarning stuff we've tried in computer security. Nobody cares about pop-up warnings.
Yeah.
People just and I think they have a point there. But forewarning is only a small part of the inoculation. The more important part, in my opinion, I mean, people debate about this, but in my opinion, the more important part is actually the pre-bunk, where you actually give people the tools. And I think from IT security, this is often missing. When I talk to our own IT security, uh, they send out these emails like warning, phishing. I'm like, but you're not giving me the weekend dose of what the attack is going to look like, what to look out for. You give me a simulation, put me in a. So what I've told our own IT security is like, do it on people in a weekend dose, fish that, send out a phishing attempt, hook them, and then explain, oh, this is IT. We just want to let you know that you've been vulnerable. You're vulnerable, and this is why, and here's how to resist it. I think that's more kind of like the games that how we make them. That's really gonna like shock people into thinking like, oh yeah, I might be susceptible. I've learned something new, rather than just these emails that tell you that this thing happens every now and then, and with some vague tips, and
Yeah.
and so that's why I think there could be a lot of improvement. And I was talking to the police force here in London a while ago, and they were telling me about these romance scams. And I wasn't an expert in this, but they said it's infrequent. But when it does happen, people are out millions, hundreds
Yeah.
of thousands sometimes. And it's like, there are tactics that are used and so maybe, pre-bunking there could be really valuable. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what are the tactics for different types of scams, and how can we inoculate people against those scams. Some are targeted at older people, right, at the elderly. Some are targeted at younger users. So yeah, I think it's very relevant in that space. What do you think?
I think, I mean, based on our conversation here, I think kind of that pre-bunking is a great way to help people. 'Cause I think it's one thing if once somebody's in the midst of being scammed, let's say let's use the romance scam. It's really hard to get people out of it because the part of one of the scammer techniques is separating a person from their family, separating them from their loved ones, separating them from the people that they trust. Like you said, using things like, well, it's us against the world, and they won't understand us. They're already, the scammers in some sense are already doing their own pre-bunking to try to get them to not trust their own family members. So it's almost, you have to get people well before they're scammed. And
Yeah, yeah,
but saying, don't answer your phone, great. Now when the doctor calls from a different number, they don't, they don't get that important call from their doctor. So like, there's some very gross generalization techniques that, yeah, well, they work, but they have other consequences, or they're just not realistic. People want to get phone calls from their friends and family. They want to get contacts. So telling them, don't ever open your email, don't respond to any text message. It can be impractical advice. I've probably
yeah,
given lots of it over the years, but I like the concept of pre-bunking and pre-inoculating people against types of scams, because then you're not talking, well, this is the specific piece of the scam. Now, this is the fake news portion of it, but here are the techniques that they use, and being aware of the techniques, then the people start to see the techniques, as opposed to, well, this is the factual information that's wrong, which I like.
yeah,
I like because it's like your cybersecurity analysis. Sure, if you do all your defense to build against this one specific attack, well, then they find out a new vulnerability and they just go there and you have no defense for it. But if you learn the pattern, the broader patterns to look for of manipulation, of subterfuge, then triggering people's emotional responses, then you start to see, okay, that's what I'm looking for, not for the individual phrase that when the person says IRS that I hang up on them.
yeah, yeah, exactly. There's some really important analogies there, actually, that maybe we could riff on a little bit. That's exactly right. So the issue we had, we started out with the sort of narrow spectrum vaccine, and because you can do that very controlled in the lab and so on. And but the exact question came up that, yeah, you're going to be very resistant to this specific type of attack, which can be useful in
Yeah,
certain contexts where a type of attack is recurrent and so on. But then you're not. They're going to find some other vulnerability, right? And so if you want to scale, it's going to be more helpful to have these sort of broader pattern recognition, that quote unquote vaccine. But the other thing you said, I think, is also really relevant for what we do, because people always ask me how to de-radicalize their uncle who believes in some crazy conspiracy theory. The thing is, de-radicalization. I've also studied cults and people and others. That's really difficult. I mean,
yeah,
that's you need to get people a different social support network. You need to get them out. They're not going to listen to you the first few times. It's going to be a long endeavor. I said it's going to be, maybe the next book is going to be how to de-radicalize people, but that's a much heavier lift. And so
yeah,
that's people are, why do you go on and on about pre-bunking? It's like, because it's much easier to inoculate than to get people out of a cult. And so it's the same with people with this romance scams. Once they're committed to this other person, you can't get them out. And so
yeah,
that's, I think the analogy there is really strong. And then what I like, that the other thing that you said that also really resonates with our research is, you can do inoculation in this in a very broad sense, very short, because social media companies always want things very short and very, very
yeah,
broad. I like the idea what you said about don't answer your phone, and then when your doctor calls from an anonymous number, you don't answer the phone. And the thing is, with inoculation, you can get some of that stuff too. Sometimes when you only do the forewarning, for example, or sometimes the inoculation makes people a bit more skeptical about credible outlets too when they use a hint of these manipulation
yeah,
tactics. And actually, you get into this really interesting debate in our area about what the right level of skepticism is. As you said, some people, to translate the analogy, my colleague who I do a lot of work with this on, he's convinced that actually, you know, you should be skeptical every time somebody calls you. So I like this level of skepticism that, if somebody calls you from an unknown number, then you're going to be maybe not answering your phone. Maybe it's good to have that level of skepticism. Other people say, okay, but what if your uncle dies or you won the lottery? There could be a huge cost to being overly skeptical
yeah,
now. Um, and so is it the same with news? Is it that, outlets that are very credible and sometimes use a little bit of manipulation, that we should, if people are now attuned to manipulation too much, that they're going to discount outlets? Some of it is sort of like, well, if the New York Times or Reuters or the BBC, who are generally well rated, factually, if they use clickbait and so on, maybe we should discount headline that we're talking about, maybe not the source, but the headline,
Yeah.
because they can make mistakes, and other people are like, okay, but we don't want to get people too skeptical. And so that's that's kind of the same here, I think, with the analogy that you use. Like, okay, you want to be skeptical enough that you're regularly investigating your emails, but you don't want to stop opening your emails, right?
Yeah.
And that's really, that fine tuning is really interesting, because we're doing a lot of experiments where we can crank the skepticism at various levels. And yeah, I'm not sure how it works in the IT space, but it's an interesting idea of how to calibrate people's skepticism.
Yeah, because like I could see it perfectly reasonable to tell people, and you see the stories where there's the scam of the college student is away and their parents get a voice AI scam calling from with the caller ID of the kid's phone. Okay, so if I get a call from my kid, should I always assume that it's not really my kid? And that we have a password that before we start any conversation that we exchange this password? It could definitely go too far, but there should be some indicators of like, if the kid is panicky and says I've kidnapped, then we need to take a step back and okay, let's figure out if that is a scam or not.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of people in our space make the argument of what's the base rate of the incidents, right? If it's really low, then should you really be concerned about
Yeah.
these type of rare instances? Other people, I'm sure you get this in security too. Other people are like, no, no, we should be vigilant about these black swan events because they're so important. And so it's sort of like, I think we're sort of in the middle where we're
Yeah.
kind of like, I agree that some heightened skepticism in this day and age is probably not a bad thing with so many scams here and there, but you don't want to go too far and just live in the woods and not see anyone anymore ever, right?
Yeah,
Um,
there is that practical aspect of it. We still want to be able to live our lives and not be afraid of every interaction that we have with something that's unknown, because otherwise we're never going to make new friends, we're never going to try new foods, we're never going to have new experiences and travel to countries we've never been to. So saying just don't do anything new, well, that makes for a really boring life.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the ways we've been able to integrate this is give people some feedback in our interventions, whether you've watched a video or did a game, we give people a little quiz with some feedback, and that seems to really help people in not taking the skepticism and then turning it on everything that seems remotely manipulative. Um, because yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Because you could take this argument and say, I get this question a lot, that look, Sander, but this emotional manipulation, a lot of marketing people use this to sell their products.
Yep.
uh what are you doing here? And so it's sort of like, well, my field is helping people resist persuasion, um particularly when it's malicious. A lot of marketing is not malicious, but I don't really see the harm in if people are recognizing that you're using some tactics, and now they're going to think twice before they buy your product. I mean, it's sort of like, well, you know you use a tactic, you can educate people on these tactics to level the playing field. That's kind of how I see it. But yeah, I think people are committed to a cause, see it as an obstacle, right? Regardless of what the cause is. That people who want to persuade see somebody who is helping people resist persuade as an obstacle.
Yep. I mean,
And so
this is the conversation that I had with Dr. Cialdini. Is that, well, at what point is it a does it switch from a marketing technique into manipulation? Where is that line? I don't know that we can easily answer. I don't know that we actually came up with a definitive answer, but like, yeah, that's where marketers have to watch out that they're not crossing a line and misrepresenting their product, misrepresenting what it can do for people. But that's the challenge. Products are always selling a lifestyle. If you buy our products, you'll be a happier person. People will like you more. When, the hair gel's not going to do that, or your car's not going to make people like you more. But that's kind of what they're selling. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
kind of the challenge, is that these are marketing techniques that are tried and true, so to speak.
Yeah, some of them are, and I think there's an analogy with social media companies there too, that there's no incentive to correct or be honest sometimes. And I think in the long term, I'm hoping that we can change some of these practices. And so, but Bob, he helped me a bit with the book because obviously, he was uncovering the six principles of persuasion, and I was uncovering the 6 degrees of manipulation, and we talked about this, and I think there are some lines. So, he talks about um, experts and how that can be persuasive to
Yeah.
people. Um, I think it's fine if you use experts to help sell your product. If these are real experts and they are honest about the product, I think that's fine
Yeah.
marketing, right? Um, where it gets into manipulation is if this is a fake expert, somebody who lied about their credentials, right, or who doesn't
That would
actually know anything about.
that would never happen.
I would not, right? And you see a lot of that, and so I think for me that's the line. So that's the
Yeah.
manipulation versus okay marketing, um, and then I think there's a difference between companies can make mistakes. You can say, oh, this product does this. We've advertised it like this. Turns out wasn't the case. Sorry, guys. Here's a refund. We're going to do better next time. I think that a record of trustworthy behavior
Yeah.
is what makes someone not explicitly manipulative, right? And so companies who know that they're doing it and they don't alert people and they keep doing it, I think
Yeah.
that's very different marketing from those who recognize that they've made a mistake and are honest about it and hope to do better next time. I think that's everyone makes mistakes, and
Yeah.
I think there's this worry in society that we can't admit to mistakes anymore, and that everyone's going to get canceled, and that nobody's going to buy a product. And I do think that um, well, in my field, we call it sort of intellectual humility, is that if we're all somewhat forgiving and humble, then maybe that creates a better culture for people to act in trustworthy ways.
Yeah, and I know the exact reason why companies don't apologize and don't fess up to mistakes is because they don't want lawsuits. There is a financial disincentive for them to admit mistakes, or it's why you get just weirdly phrased. Like it kind of sounds like they're apologizing, but they're not really apologizing, which always makes me mistrust people when I hear a non-apology apology. But because they're trying to do it in a way that their lawyers have vetted that says that won't put us in legal jeopardy. Yeah, throw lawsuits into the mix, and it messes all this stuff up.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that is a great, the lawsuit element is looming over most of these companies. I think that's absolutely right. And that is a system. So we get back to the system question, which I conveniently avoided. But the last thing I'll say on that is that it's true. I'm absolutely sympathetic to the idea that at the system level things need to change, right? So companies shouldn't be incentivized to lie if it makes it so that if the incentives go the wrong way. It's the same for social media companies. And so um, do we need the government to take stronger action? I mean, I'm not a policy expert, and people have different opinions on this, and there's this whole debate on free speech, obviously. But I do think that there are clear problems with the system, that we
Yeah,
need better guardrails. Who's going to implement these guardrails? Who's responsible? I think we shouldn't put the onus all on people. I mean, it's not. I mean, the people didn't necessarily design the system. Some of people are being trapped in the system or forced to work with it. And so, I think the social media companies, the governments, other actors, they're responsible for enacting some larger system level change. And I do slightly worry sometimes that our approach, which is adapted by social media companies and governments and other actors, that we don't want this to be an excuse for not doing the harder things, right? Changing
yeah,
the algorithm, taking down content if it's violating hate speech policies or some stuff. And so that's the tricky balance, right? That as long as the individual measures don't undermine the system level measures, then I think it's fine. But yeah, it's a trade-off.
yeah. It's almost that you hope if you can poke at this from 40 different angles and everybody gives a little bit cumulatively, there's a large advancement without any one entity, source, point of view overriding all the rest, and then you just incrementally creep in hopefully in a good way as opposed to a bad way.
Exactly. And the people who say, oh no, it's the system. We need to change the system. You're a distraction. And the people who say, no, you can't trust the system. People have to change. I hope everyone now recognizes that is a false dilemma, and
Yes.
there is some nuance. Yeah,
That's a good example, even coming out of our conversation. It is a false dilemma that it's either the system or it's people. Or that
exactly.
there's even, it may only, and there's probably way more than two ways to tackle this broad issue. So I wanted to ask you before we close out. You talked a bit about some videos and some games. Are those things that are publicly available that our audience can take a look at and participate in?
Absolutely. Everything's free, publicly available for educational and non-commercial purposes on inoculation.science. So the website is inoculation.science. All of our resources are housed there. It's also in the book. People can read about it, which is foolproofbook.com.
Awesome. If people want to follow you online, how can they connect with you?
Yeah, I'm still for the moment on X at Sander_VD Linden. I'm on LinkedIn. I play around with Instagram and TikTok under Professor Sander van der Linden, but I'm not very prolific on TikTok and Instagram. It's beyond my generation, I think. But yeah, Twitter and LinkedIn are my main channel.
Awesome. We will make sure to link all of those on our site so that people don't have to write it down while they're driving and they can easily visit the website and just click. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.